My birthday is August 6th, and this also happens to be the day that Hiroshima was bombed in 1945. So that's a fun coincidence. Anyways, you might be asking yourself, why is he making a video about a movie that came out more than 6 months ago? Well, it's because this movie has become one of my favorites of all time. I've seen it several times now, and each time I'm enthralled with the scope of this film, the filmmaking, the music, the performances. But most of all, this movie is a feast for nerds like me because it has so much history, science, and philosophy. And the film offers a very important discussion about nuclear weapons, about the philosophical and ethical ramifications of the fact that we live in a world with nuclear weapons. And it's becoming more important to discuss these ramifications given current global conflicts that are raising the specter of nuclear weapons actually being used, which is a terrifying possibility, which is far too probable for comfort. So join me in this discussion of Oppenheimer, which, by the way, will contain very heavy spoilers. The movie opens with young Oppie very intensely observing the way raindrops are creating these ripples in the water, and he's watching the way the waves interfere. And then we get a shot of what appears to be a nuclear weapon detonating, I think in slow-mo, so you can actually see the process. And it's just very ominous, and it looks great. And then you can see these faint black letters, which become more visible as the glowing light from the explosion lights up the entire screen. And it reads, "Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. For this, he was chained to a rock and tortured for eternity." When I first saw that, I thought that was such a perfect line for the opening of this movie. And the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods takes on a whole new meaning in the context of the atom bomb. And it's just such a great myth to reference for this film, because stealing fire from the gods, according to my interpretation, has a lot to do with awakening consciously. And being conscious in and of itself is a kind of torment, it's a kind of burden. But it becomes an even heavier burden for someone like Oppenheimer when he uses his brilliant consciousness to create a world-ending device. And Oppie's suffering in this movie is all about the fact that he feels guilty for making the bomb and helping decide how it was used. And we understand why Oppie is so torn about this as we learn more about his character. So the next shot is of him at his security clearance. Now, no one divides the story between colored images and black and white images, which he also did in his movie Memento, which is really good, by the way, highly recommended. Oppie's side of the story is called Fission, and the black and white images are from Lewis Strauss's perspective, and they're called Fusion. And the story is essentially split between these perspectives. The Oppenheimer storyline pretty much just centers around his life, whereas the Strauss storyline centers around his Senate confirmation hearing. And I think one way to interpret the meaning of the names fission and fusion for these two different parts of the story become clearer from what we learn later, in that Oppie was responsible for creating the fission bomb, but he actively opposed the creation of the hydrogen bomb, the fusion bomb, whereas Strauss in some ways helped to facilitate it, at least according to this movie. So it's as if Oppie is dealing with the consequences of his creation, but Strauss also has to face the consequences of the fact that he helped facilitate the creation of the fusion bomb. We see Oppenheimer's time at Cambridge when he was a university student, and he's having a terrible experience because they're trying to get him to do these experiments to, empirically confirm or disprove the theories that they come up with. But Oppenheimer doesn't want to work in the lab with his hands. He just wants to sit around and think about physics and come up with theories and models for how things work. He wants to work with his imagination. He's someone who works more with his mind than with his hands. And in this environment, he isn't able to think freely and let his mind explore these ideas. This is quite relatable to me because I'm also super interested in physics, but as somebody who spends a lot of time in my own imagination, I like to use my mind to think about physics from a theoretical perspective and gain new insights like that, although I do have a great deal of respect for experimentalists who honestly have to do the hard work. We also see a recurring theme in this movie, which is Oppenheimer's neuroticism, because he tries to poison his teacher, which I think actually happened. Like, damn, Oppie could be pretty crazy at times, but I guess that's pretty normal with geniuses. Anyways, he's desperate to talk to Niels Bohr, who's played so well by Kenneth Branagh. I think he's one of the standouts, really, even though he's only in like a couple of scenes. Because you can tell Bohr sees exactly what Oppie needs, which is just to stare at walls and think about quantum mechanics. Let his imagination do all the work so that he understands it more deeply. And so they send him to Göttingen, where they're all about theoretical physics. Just as a side note, Niels Bohr is also somebody who I find super fascinating because he helped come up with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which weirdly makes the prediction that the properties of things only take on values when we measure them. So the world has this kind of inherent state of indeterminacy, of superposition, of being in multiple places at once, and it only really gains definite values when we measure it. The active measurement doesn't just learn about these values, it actively creates them and helps to define them. And this, by implication, predicted that it would be possible to influence events on the other side of the universe through a process called quantum entanglement, which logically sounds very obviously wrong, and Einstein thought this was extremely ludicrous, and they had these great famous debates about this. But it was later shown that Niels Bohr was actually right, that the universe does actually behave this way. I'll link a video for additional information if you want to learn more about that, but it's very fascinating that Bohr was able to disprove Einstein. And then we get to see Oppie in his prime, where he's just free to think and let his mind loose on these ideas. And while in Göttingen, he goes to art museums and explores European culture. He has this time where he's just able to freely explore his interests. And with that freedom, he becomes extraordinarily successful. I think he ended up publishing like 12 papers while he was there. The music in this scene is really phenomenal as well. And that's one of the things that really sells the movie for me. The music is really good. And then we see an important scene which ties the movie together. First, from the perspective of fusion, so Strauss's perspective. And they do a good job of humanizing Strauss, despite the fact that he's ultimately the villain and way too motivated by personal vendettas. Because right from the start, you can see that he's trying to impress Oppenheimer. But Oppie right away is just sort of a dick to him and kind of undermines him. Then, after Oppie talks to Einstein, Einstein walks away with an angry face and ignores Strauss as he walks by him. Strauss thinks that Oppie said something negative about him to Einstein, but we later find out that Oppie said something way more, how should I put it, pessimistic, to say the least. Anyways, I found it a really cool idea to anchor the film on this scene and use it to send out the film's final message. While he's in Europe, Oppie meets Isidore Rabi, who I thought was a great character and also a standout. Rabi finds out that Oppenheimer learned to speak Dutch in 6 weeks. Not just to speak it fluently, but to give a lecture on quantum mechanics, which is mind-blowing. I mean, Oppie must have been a next-level genius if he was able to do that, especially without the language learning tools that we have today. It must have meant that he really understood the structure of a language in order to be able to learn it so quickly. And this is also evident from the fact that he learned Sanskrit, for God's sake. And I thank Christopher Nolan for including this aspect of Oppenheimer because it really sells his genius. The scenes between Oppenheimer and Rabi also leave you with the first impression that something is brewing in Europe, especially regarding Europe's Jews. And that's another thing about this movie. The historical events in the world at the time of all of this are discussed in the movie, and so it's a great film for history nerds, because it discusses things like the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and the McCarthy era. All of these significant events are taking place in the background of the film, and you can see their influence on the trajectory of the story. Oppie then becomes friends with Werner Heisenberg, who he meets in Germany. And in hindsight, this is actually really sad, because you can tell that they both understand each other, and they've even both inspired each other. And so they regard each other as rather impressive. But then later circumstances force them to become enemies. It shows just how war can set humanity back collectively, not just for the side that loses the war. And from what I know, I think Heisenberg was actually a good guy. He was just forced to work for the Nazis because they were the Nazis, and it was either work for them or be accused of being a communist infiltrator trying to mislead German scientists with the Jew-corrupted theory of quantum mechanics. I do wonder if Heisenberg couldn't make a bomb because of the stress of being in a dystopian hell like Nazi Germany. But fun fact for you, when Oppie was in Europe, he also met a number of famous scientists, including Wolfgang Pauli, who, if you know, was a good friend of Carl Jung's. But he also met Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, who you see later in the movie, and Edward Teller. And I mentioned Teller because Teller is actually a rather crucial character, both in the movie and in history. And it's interesting to know that Oppenheimer knew him this far back. So Oppie comes back to America to teach quantum mechanics, as it's proven very successful. And I love the scenes where Oppie is first teaching quantum mechanics, because at first he just has one student, but he's so passionate about it, and eventually he gets his students to collaborate with each other and even work out the mathematical details for things like black holes. And this is also when we get a glimpse of Oppie's left-wing leaning views, which aren't surprising if you know what he got up to in Europe when he was free to explore ideas, particularly in England and Weimar Germany. But even though he was in America and he thought he was free to express his opinions, he hadn't sensed that the political winds had shifted dramatically, and that the world was becoming increasingly polarized, especially in the midst of a conflict like the Spanish Civil War, which was just so devastating, in which one side was supported by Nazi Germany and the other side was supported by the Soviet Union. And so it was clear that things in the world were becoming very tense and ideologically polarized, and this naturally led to a lot of paranoia in the US. But Oppie seemed to be more concerned with the fact that an elected government in Spain was being overthrown by some army generals, and he was concerned about the many refugees that this crisis was creating. So you can really see that he cares about humanity and about freedoms, which is why he supported the Republicans in Spain. But it's also why he was sympathetic to left-leaning ideas. And this is a recurring theme in the movie. The way people are persecuted by being clumped with something in a very dichotomous way. You support unions? That makes you a communist. You see that red flag? Paint that shit black. He meets Jean Tatlock and brags about the fact that he's read Marx in the original German, which is a smooth way to get a communist chick. But she's a great character in the movie. You can tell that Oppenheimer likes the fact that she's kind of like him. Intellectually curious, but also kind of unstable. And from the scene, you also realize that Oppenheimer's not super ideologically motivated. He wants to read the original books himself rather than trusting someone else's opinion on it, which I find to be very admirable and something that I personally strive to do, although not always successfully. Shortly after this scene is the scene where Oppie lets Jean into his wiggle room. Jung gets a reference here, which I liked because it's nice to know that other people think about him and not just weirdos like me. Although I guess Christopher Nolan is his own kind of weirdo, and he probably would be very familiar with Jung, especially from movies like Inception. This scene is also where they mention the Bhagavad Gita, which, if you know me, is one of my favorite works of literature ever. And this was written several thousand years ago. It's just such an incredible work, and it goes to places which I don't ever see Western literature going to, all during a conversation between a god and a prince. And it just shows how impressive Oppenheimer was as a person to want to seek out the work in its original meaning, and you can tell that he recognized that there was something spiritually powerful in the Gita. Now at this point, there's a major breakthrough in physics because they're successfully able to split the atom by shooting neutrons at it. And they realize that if an atom releases more neutrons when it gets split, those neutrons might hit more atoms, which will then split and then release their neutrons, and it could lead to a chain reaction. It's amusing how their first idea is, wait, we can make this into a weapon. And this realization happens at around the same time that Hitler invades Poland, which actually did happen on the same day that Oppenheimer's black hole paper was released, so that's an extremely unpleasant coincidence. Nevertheless, it then dawns on everyone that the Nazis, who are tearing a path across Europe without anybody being able to stop them, invading neighbor after neighbor who are able to offer very little resistance against this war machine, and who are rounding up everybody who they deem to be Untermenschen and massacring them, this nightmarish regime could be in possession of a nuclear weapon. And they were probably already developing it. That is a horrifying thought, and it almost came true. And so you can see how creating the fission bomb was seen as a matter of survival. And this is also why Oppenheimer stopped being a pacifist, as the Communist Party of America was at that time, especially when he understood what the Nazis were doing to Jews like him. The story of history is so fascinating, yet it's also terrifying when you're going through it. But it must be incredible to watch this like a movie playing out. The fact that this history-changing device, potentially history-ending device, came into being because of the darkest period of human history so far, just shows the absolute perplexity of the universe we live in. What an incredible story, the story of humanity, and Oppenheimer depicts a pivotal moment in that history. Then Oppie meets Groves, played by Matt Damon, in a really great scene. Groves is super straight to the point and trying to skim through all of the formalities as quickly as possible. But Oppie doesn't seem to be intimidated by him, and in fact, he convinces Groves to make him director when he goes on this monologue where he essentially breaks down what it means to turn theory into a practical weapon system, and explains how all of America's industrial might needs to be employed for this massive undertaking. He also explains what he can deduce about the German program, including the fact that the Nazis have these super talented scientists at their disposal, like Heisenberg and many others. Germany had a long tradition of intellectual greatness, and now that greatness was threatening the world. And they realize that the only hope is that Hitler is so obsessed with feeding his endless war machine that he doesn't provide any military resources to the scientists trying to build the bomb, which turned out to be the case. I mean, why use a talented physicist to build a superweapon when we can use him to be ein Panzerkommandant? We learned that Groves was the one who built the Pentagon, and he's an incredible engineer, and so he's perfect for a task like this. He quickly secures a bunch of uranium ore, but it turns out that this isn't as important as they thought. But it's still fascinating that the uranium bomb worked. More on that later when I discuss the bombs and their designs. But Groves was apparently a staunch conservative, in contrast to the very liberal-minded Oppenheimer. And I think that this melding of these opposite mindsets made for a great combination, which ultimately led to the production of the bomb. You need people like like Oppenheimer who are more eccentric and creative and able to generate ideas, but you also need people like Groves who ensure that everyone stays disciplined, well organized, and sensitive to security matters. We also learned that Groves protected Oppenheimer from dangerous people in the US Army who were searching for any hint of communist infiltration, which is really interesting because it means that Groves understood how crucial and vital Oppie was for the project, and that he couldn't lose him because of this nonsense. Which is why he decided to protect him from other soldiers, in particular this one colonel who is apparently the son of a Russian Orthodox priest. So Oppenheimer convinces Groves that Los Alamos is the best place to build a town where they can build the bomb. And it just shows how like the huge amount of space that the US had was one of its greatest assets, because it meant a huge amount of space for things like this, but also a huge amount of natural resources. They then go recruiting scientists in a really great scene, and one scientist tells him that his past associations with communism are going to pretty much ensure that he fails a security check. Oppenheimer tries to tell him that this is a national emergency and that they need to take up this responsibility because they're the only people in the free world who have the knowledge to understand nuclear physics. But he reminds Oppie that there's going to be a time when the war is done, and perhaps then their skeletons will come back to haunt them. And this foreshadows what's going to happen later with Oppie. So as they're constructing Los Alamos, we get this great scene with Izzy and Oppie because they're trying to figure out who should run the theoretical division. Oppie proposes that it should be Izzy, but then Izzy reveals that he doesn't want to come to Los Alamos because he's morally torn. He doesn't want the culmination of the most incredible advances in the field of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction. And the scene is so good, especially with the music and with his performance, because Izzy's realizing that a weapon like this is really indiscriminate, and so unless you have a large enough military target, it's going to be used against civilians. Creating a weapon like this puts so much responsibility in the hands of whoever wields it. But honestly, who could be trusted with power like that? The very act of bringing it into creation stains their hands with blood. And they understand that very well, but Oppie tells Izzy that he doesn't know whether the US can be trusted with such a weapon, but he does know that the Nazis can't. Which again, must have been horrifying to contemplate. A regime like that, with a power like that. Like I've said before, history can be very terrifying. We then get an introduction to Edward Teller, the Hungarian scientist who would later be known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller interrupts the meeting because he's claimed he's discovered a very troubling possibility. Teller is a lot like Oppenheimer, in that he had these really intriguing, really out there ideas. And it seems like he was given a lot of disrespect for proposing these rather outlandish ideas, even though in all honesty they were extremely brilliant. In this case, he realized that a fission weapon might release so much energy that it would cause the hydrogen in the atmosphere to collide with each other and fuse into helium. That process would release way more energy than fission, because fusion produces more energy than fission. But if this happens in the atmosphere, it could cause a chain reaction where the entire atmosphere fuses, leading to this catastrophic event, destroying the entire world. This incident becomes a great metaphor for the movie, and even though it was shown to be very unlikely, because, the hydrogen in the atmosphere is not very dense, and so the odds of a hydrogen hitting another hydrogen are just so low that the probability of this actually happening is just extremely low. But it's still really fascinating to me that they came up with this as a possibility, seriously considered it, and now we have it to be a great metaphor for the movie's final message. Now, I'm not sure if historically Teller was the one who realized this possibility, but we do know that he understood that a fission weapon could be used to trigger a fusion reaction. And this understanding would eventually lead to the development of the hydrogen bomb, which has its own set of moral quandaries. Again, the fact that Teller even conceptualized the hydrogen bomb shows just how much of a genius he was, but he also did seem to be very motivated by personal prestige and achievement, without realizing what a weapon like this would mean for the rest of the world. The fact that he wasn't being respected by his colleagues may have also contributed to that desire to accomplish something great, but he didn't realize that the thing he was accomplishing was actually kind of nightmarish. So Oppie goes to discuss the possibility of destroying the world with Einstein. In real life, it was Arthur Compton with whom he discussed it, but this scene is still great because it features a cameo from Kurt Gödel, who I was pleasantly surprised to see. Like I said, this movie is just a feast for nerds. But you also see how dire the world is at this point, especially from Gödel's perspective, because he had to flee Austria because he's Jewish, and now he lives in this paranoid state where he's afraid that the Nazis can poison him from all the way over there. And we can see what the costs are of being a genius like him. In Kurt Gödel's case, it led him to be very paranoid, unhealthily so. So Einstein looks at the calculations, realizes what they could mean, and he tells Oppenheimer that if this turns out to be true, you need to tell the Nazis so that they also don't destroy the world. But personally, I'm not convinced that the Nazis would care. I'm pretty sure destroying the world was like their main prerogative. So at the next meeting amongst the scientists where they discuss how to proceed, they're given these 2 spheres to show just how much uranium they would need or just how much plutonium they would need to synthesize. So plutonium was this new element that was synthesized when it was created in nuclear reactors. And it was actually way simpler to do this than to refine uranium-238 into uranium-235. So both of these elements, uranium-235 and plutonium, have this property where they just kind of shoot a neutron every once in a while, becoming a different element in the process. And the idea behind a nuclear weapon is that you take enough of this material and you compress it so much that when a neutron flies off from one of these atoms, there's a good chance that it'll hit another atom and then cause that one to split. And then that'll release a neutron and then cause a different atom to split, leading to this chain reaction. And then the whole thing would just go kablamo. And so it's really all about raising the probability of this occurring by squishing the material together. With U-235, you can do this by shooting them rapidly at each other so that it all clumps together and sets off the nuclear reaction. Or with plutonium, what you need to do is surround it with explosives and then set all those explosives off at once so that the material becomes super compressed, and then that'll set off the reaction. It's an implosion device. And the movie focuses more on the implosion device, probably because it looks cooler, but you can imagine a device like that requiring an insane amount of engineering precision in order to make. Because you need to accurately synchronize all of the explosions and also make sure that the explosions occur in the exact same way. Otherwise, you won't get that precise compression that you need. An ingenious innovation that the scientists came up with, which isn't shown in the film unfortunately, is the fact that the plutonium device, in the very center of it, had this small ball of polonium and beryllium. Because when those 2 elements chemically interact, it releases this flood of neutrons. So these free neutrons could be used to collide with the plutonium, and that would set off the chain reaction. So this was a really brilliant use of the properties of these chemicals in order to make the bomb as efficient as possible. And it really emphasizes how intelligent our species had become at this point, where we're able to understand things on this super deep level. Like I said, this is the consequence of stealing fire from the gods. But I personally also find it really fascinating that there are these 2 potential fuels for a nuclear bomb, but they are just different enough that you can't use the same mechanisms to detonate them. And this is because the plutonium wouldn't work in a gun-type device. You can't shoot it at another slab of plutonium. You can only compress it using the implosion device. So during this discussion between the Los Alamos scientists, where they're trying to decide whether to use a uranium bomb or a plutonium bomb, Teller steps in and proposes that they take it even one step further, and suggests that they use hydrogen instead. His idea is to set off a fusion reaction using a fission bomb. An idea which actually seemed feasible, and it just shows how Teller was leaps ahead of everyone else. These ideas seemed very outlandish, but it turns out that they were correct. Which is great for Teller personally because it means that he was right, but kind of horrible for the rest of humanity. We then come to one of my favorite scenes, which is shown from the fusion perspective, so from Strauss's perspective, where he has to convene an AEC meeting. Because they've uncovered evidence that the Soviets have their own bomb, their own fission device, and it appears to be a plutonium implosion device, just like the one that they built at Los Alamos. This scene is great because Oppie's in the scene, but he isn't shown as the main character. And I thought this was a great choice because the situation brings Oppie under a lot of scrutiny. Because while he was at Los Alamos, he understood the importance of having these open discussions with everybody so that they could all contribute their ideas. But this was seen as a security risk. Oppie was also insistent on visiting Chicago without a security clearance because Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, they created the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction there. So even with his past, he was still pushing up against the security apparatus in a really reckless way, but that's just kind of the person he was. Eccentric, neurotic, and somebody who valued his freedom. If I may also add, it warms my heart that some scientists decided to use this newfound knowledge to create a device which would just generate electricity rather than be used to kill people. Oppie was also approached by a friend of his, a communist, who was seeking any information which he could pass on to the Soviets. And he didn't report it, which is definitely a very bad look for him. But if I'm being honest, when I first saw that scene, I didn't realize that he was supposed to report it. But now I know, if I'm ever approached by a foreign government looking for secrets, although I'm not sure what secrets I would have, I'll report it, even if they offer me monetary incentives. I am a loyal citizen, and I can't be persuaded to betray my country. Now, the urgency of that AEC meeting where they discussed the fact that the Soviets have the bomb is really clear because it shows the geopolitics in a nuclear age and just how tense they were. because all of this just didn't end with the Nazis. And now they were facing this dilemma of the fact that their main rival, who was previously their ally, now has a weapon of mass destruction. All of history had been changed for a second time, because now, if a war were to break out between nuclear powers, it would be unlike any war that had been fought heretofore. The last World War was already this chaotic, ugly mess. But with nuclear weapons, it became this frightening possibility that something worse could be unleashed. And we should think about this from the American perspective, because the bomb was now in the hands of something that they were so ideologically opposed to, especially given that the Soviets were still being run by the brutal, thuggish regime of Stalin, a man who used violence to get whatever he wanted. I'm surprised that Stalin never actually used the bomb during his life. Maybe if he had lived longer, he would have eventually said, fuck it. But thank God we don't live in that timeline. So it's especially scary to know that the Soviets are now in possession of this weapon, and Oppenheimer himself is facing a serious dilemma. On the one hand, the Soviets are clearly pursuing an arms race against the US, and this is a threat to the US, or more specifically the US-led world order, but also to the US directly. But responding to this development by creating an even bigger bomb, the hydrogen fusion bomb, seems like unleashing something into the world that's orders of magnitude worse than even the fission bombs. Which is really saying something. Because if the Soviets find out that the Americans are pursuing a hydrogen bomb, it would trigger an arms race because human nature pretty much dictates it. As the Soviets would see the Americans having the H-bomb as a threat to their very survival. And because of this chain of suspicion between the two superpowers, the inevitable arms race between them would eventually lead to the development and production of enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. Robert wants nothing to do with that. He doesn't want to live in a world with that many nuclear weapons. And so in this scene, he's trying his best to prevent the H-bomb from being built. And instead, his idea is to encourage negotiation and arms treaties so that they can agree to not develop these weapons further. But again, both sides had this ideological fear of the other, which just made them paranoid. And they had this mindset of, well, maybe if we stop, they're going to secretly continue to do it. And if you consider the Russian perspective and consider what their mindset was, they had every right to be worried about the West being in possession of nuclear weapons. Because not so long ago, a regime from the West, from Central Europe, tried to exterminate all of them. And this happened before, first Napoleon, but then Hitler. The Russians were deeply traumatized by these invasions that kept happening. And the last one was particularly brutal. The number of Soviet citizens who died during World War II is unbelievable. And so when you get your head around that perspective, you can understand why they too felt the need to have nuclear weapons. And it's a really important thing to realize that many of the scars caused by World War II still haven't fully healed. And we can see that playing out today in today's conflicts. Meanwhile, the scientists are all complaining about Teller because he seems super fixated on working on the hydrogen bomb rather than helping with the fission bomb. And Teller tries to quit when Hans Bethe insults him. But Oppie insists on keeping him on the project and letting him explore whatever he wants freely, because he knows how smart Teller is and how good his ideas are. But despite this, we see Oppie fight against the development of the super afterwards, because he knows that it would just make the world more dangerous. We see the rest of the AEC meeting, this time from the fission storyline, so it's from Oppie's point of view, and you can see that he's becoming totally dismayed as the scientists are casually discussing entire cities just being destroyed. So he feels obligated to stop the H-bomb from being developed, and proposes arms control through the UN. But it seems that the US would never submit to the UN, especially when they don't trust the communists, and because making the H-bomb would dramatically increase their own power. And I think this is a huge motivator for nuclear bombs in the first place. It's all about power. Because any country with bombs like this would instantly become a great power, at least in theory. I don't think in practice that has panned out so much. I find this scene kind of amusing because Izzy is drawing circles on maps to show the blast radius from hydrogen bombs dropped on cities. And I love that Izzy was previously on the verge of tears at the fact that they were going to build the atom bomb, but now he's like, Russia's going to piss their pants when they find out how many of these things we've built. Am I right? So it goes back to when Oppie was still directing Los Alamos, and some of the workers start having discussions about the ethics of building the bomb. Because at this point, the Germans have been defeated, Hitler is dead, but the Japanese still fight on. And this scene harkens back to those earlier scenes when he was involved in organizing union drives at his university. Other scientists are also trying to petition the president to not use these weapons against Japan. But Oppie argues that the world won't really understand nuclear bombs until they see the power demonstrated clearly and unambiguously. And then they can establish a new peace based on international cooperation, since the existence of nuclear bombs will presumably deter wars from ever happening again. And in some ways, this vision has actually panned out. Yes, the world has been teetering on the edge of destruction for some time, and there have been many wars, particularly in the developing world, but by and large, the world has remained remarkably stable. But you still have to grapple with the fact that the existence of any nuclear bomb is a threat to humanity. We are not a trustworthy species, and at some point, a leader is going to get it into his head that he needs to start using these. Jung wrote that firearms will eventually go off themselves if given enough time. And for me, it seems hard to imagine fully resisting the urge to not use these weapons and unleash their power, especially by some bad actor in the future. So it comes time to pick a target for the bombs to be used against Japan. And this is an important scene because it lays out the various rationales that were used to make the decision to drop the bombs on Japan and where to drop them. The argument for using the bomb at this point in time is that it will coerce the Japanese to surrender, as they'll quickly realize that all resistance is futile in the face of these weapons. And this is particularly desirable for America because the Japanese are fiercely patriotic and are willing to die to defend their country. And so an invasion of the mainland will end up killing millions, both American and Japanese. So there's a good argument for using this thing against Japan to save lives, even if it means killing innocent civilians. And during the scene, I laughed out loud at the dark humor on display when Kyoto was taken off the list because the defense secretary vacationed there and he thinks it's a great city. Like, Jesus Christ, thousands of lives who might have ended were saved by the pen stroke of some guys in an office, and thousands of others were killed by said pen strokes. But I honestly think that America's main motivation was to flex its muscles for the rest of the world. They couldn't help but use it and demonstrate the power that they possessed, and of course they had the perfect excuse to do so since the war was still raging. Then comes the moment to test the bomb, and it was amazing how this movie was able to create so much tension over an event we all know the outcome of. But you can tell that a lot of the tension comes from understanding how the characters must have felt in that situation. Because they spent $2 billion, had been working on it for 3 years, and it was all leading up to this moment, and it was possible that it wouldn't be successful. And the explosion scene is really epic. As you see the light from the explosion, which is just this blindingly bright fireball, before you hear this thunderous sound, which was a super cool way to deliver this double whammy of the bomb's power. Once for the blinding light, and then again for this massive shockwave. It's also accurate in what the Los Alamos scientists would have experienced. A brightness brighter than the sun, followed by this sound that was probably louder than anything they'd ever heard. And this sound shocked me when I was in the theater. It was so thunderous. Now, an interesting bit of information to know is that they tested the plutonium implosion device during the Trinity test, but they didn't test the gun-type device that used uranium. And I don't think they actually tested the gun-type device before they dropped it on Hiroshima. They just dropped it, hoping it would work, hoping that the uranium would set off, and then they would only announce it if it did go off. If it didn't, the Japanese wouldn't know anything because presumably the bomb would just be destroyed from the impact. And then, of course, they could just use a plutonium bomb, which they knew worked. But damn, the uranium bomb actually did work, which shows just how professional and knowledgeable these scientists were, because they were so confident that the bomb would work, even though they hadn't tested the gun-type uranium device. But shortly after the detonation, it begins to dawn on Oppie that what he has made is no longer in his control. And this is illustrated really well through the scene where Oppie's watching the trucks with the bombs loaded onto them drive away. And now that it exists, now that he has brought it into existence, the world will never be the same. And Oppenheimer only really understands after it has been detonated, when he's like, what did we just make and who did we just give it to? After the Japanese are bombed on August 6th, which is my birthday, and August 9th, is when Oppie begins to morally reckon with the danger that he helped to facilitate. And you can see that he's super torn about what happened in Japan. Because remember, he's somebody who cares about ordinary civilians. That's why he supported the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. And he's watching all of these people cheer about America's victory, while meanwhile he's coming to realize what has just happened and how he's partially responsible for it. it really dawns on him that a world with nuclear weapons isn't a safe world. Then he goes to meet President Truman, who was played by Gary Oldman. And the first time I saw this, I had no idea it was Gary Oldman. He just completely disappeared into this role. And his performance in this brief scene is just so good, because it highlights just how much Oppenheimer has lost control of his creation. So much so that Truman doesn't consider Oppenheimer to really be the one responsible for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He considers himself to be responsible. And he talks about them so coldly. And it shows what a scary asshole he was, despite his mild demeanor and his stupid bow tie. Although I never had the impression that he was so cold-hearted from what I knew about him. But I guess you can't really be a leader of a major global power like the United States without being an asshole on some level. And Truman calls Oppenheimer a crybaby, which is just so disheartening because Oppie, you know he has a good heart, and he knows that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were these enormous catastrophes. But Truman's like, whatever. So despite Oppie's best attempts to prevent the creation of the hydrogen bomb, Truman approves of the project anyways, which Oppie regards as a blow to the world. And it's in this same scene that we learn that there was a spy at Los Alamos. The British scientist, or the originally German Jewish scientist, Klaus Fuchs, had been spying for the Soviets the whole time. And this is a really interesting fact because it showed that some people, after witnessing what happened at Trinity and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thought of the US as just another evil empire with ugly, greedy ideological motivations. Who really is the good guy and the bad guy in the Cold War? We say it was the Soviets, and in my personal opinion, the Soviets were very unpleasant. But even people who worked on the bomb disagreed, and perhaps they saw a unipolar world dominated with the US as the sole possessor of nuclear bombs as an enormous threat to the world in and of itself. And they might have been right. It's hard to know what the consequences of just one power having nuclear bombs would have been because we're living in the timeline where multiple powers have them and have somehow managed to not use them against each other. So maybe it's the fact that they've had them and the fact that they've recognized, the doctrine of MAD, of mutually assured destruction. It's a recognition of that fact that has made them reluctant to use these weapons, whereas if just one power had them, maybe they would have used them to dominate the world completely and just instantly vaporize anybody who challenged their authority. But the fact that there was a spy also demonstrates that the way Oppie conducted things at Los Alamos did ultimately lead to security compromises. That's the risk he took when he had this very liberal approach to getting his crew together and sharing ideas and having these open discussions. That approach got them the bomb, but it also meant sharing of a lot of information, and some of that information got into the wrong hands and eventually to the Soviets. And this is where the rift between Oppenheimer and Teller really rips open. Because I think Teller was very interested in pursuing his own achievements with the hydrogen bomb, which would have been his legacy. But meanwhile, Oppenheimer is discouraging him. And that might have been personal for Teller, because he's dealing with these great scientists who don't seem to recognize his genius. But of course, for Oppie, his opposition to Teller isn't because he thinks Teller's ideas are outlandish, it's because he knows Teller's ideas are good and could actually be used to produce the hydrogen bomb. He understood that Teller was a genius. And that's exactly the reason why he opposes him. And this is probably why Teller testifies against Oppenheimer at the security clearance hearing. But I think that it's nice that the two men still seem to respect each other, symbolized by the handshake. So during the fusion storyline, it becomes revealed that Strauss was the one who initiated the security clearance hearing against Oppenheimer, and he sets it up so that the odds are stacked against Oppenheimer. Strauss's vendetta against Oppenheimer was also a part of the kind of McCarthy-era way of thinking that was just so destructive. Strauss's vendetta against Oppenheimer was due to their numerous differences. Strauss was fairly conservative, and he was also religious. Both Strauss and Oppenheimer were Jewish, but Strauss actually practiced his religion proudly, whereas Oppenheimer didn't seem to give it much attention. And also, importantly, because of the fact that they disagreed about the hydrogen bomb. There was something else involving like the shipment of isotopes to Norway, but I think importantly, the fact that he fought him on the hydrogen bomb was the more significant kind of disagreement between them. And the whole fusion storyline shows what was a very toxic influence in America and American politics during the Cold War, this obsessive paranoia about communists, which barely made sense at times, especially against someone like Oppenheimer. Of course, their reasons for being so worried about communists might have made sense from their own perspective, since they saw communism as tyrannical and completely antithetical to their own values. But oftentimes, the witch hunt against people who were accused of being communists just for joining a union or wanting higher taxes on the rich was just used to advance individuals' careers, more so than to protect the country from a threat. And it did seem to push against a lot of the values that I think America was supposed to stand for. Freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. That freedom was being undermined because politicians were trying to elevate their own status by demonizing others. And it also showed how demonization, especially at this point in history, had evolved beyond religious and ethnic spheres, but now encompassed an ideological dimension. In this case, about particular economic doctrines, which really shows how money and different attitudes toward money was kind of like the driving force behind these ideologies, and how it was driving this enormous global polarization between the US and the USSR. And of course, I personally think that accusing anybody with liberal-leaning views of being a Marxist or of being a communist is unproductive and usually inaccurate. I've discussed that before, but maybe I'll talk about that more in the future. Now, in the context of this story, it's really clear that Oppie is a loyal citizen who did his duty at Los Alamos and that he loves America and he's very patriotic. And yet, because of this obsession with hunting communists, he is accused of being a Soviet spy. And from Cillian Murphy's performance, you can see just how painful this is for Oppenheimer to hear about these accusations, because imagine being a genuinely loyal citizen who never betrayed your country, and yet it's being written into the historical record that some guy thinks it's more probable than not that you're a Soviet spy, a traitor to your country. And it's crazy how Oppie's humanitarian concerns to save lives and prevent a nuclear war are being used to prove that he's been influencing American nuclear policy under a Soviet directive for the benefit of the Soviets. We get a great scene where Oppenheimer's wife thankfully pokes a lot of holes in this obsessive demonization of communists. Because again, all Oppie really did was read communist books and try to help Spanish refugees. Emily Blunt is great in this scene, and she really shines here. But then Oppie is questioned about why he supported the development of the fission bomb, but not the fusion bomb. And this is a great scene, which shows a major problem with today's culture of scrutinizing people when we're trying to cancel them. Because there's a bias in our psychology that's at play here, which is really destructive. And that's the fact that we as humans find it problematic when a person has an opinion or a set of opinions at one point in time, but then changes them later on. We, for some reason, see this as hypocrisy, but oftentimes it is just somebody changing their mind in response to new information. Which is what we should encourage. We shouldn't encourage people to stick rigidly with the opinions that they used to have, but consider new opinions and new ideas so that they develop their conceptions in a more sophisticated way. But because of the rational way of thinking, which is predominant in today's society and in modern human psychology, we demand consistency throughout time, and we're sensitive to inconsistencies that seem like hypocrisy to us. But again, this biases us against people who are willing to change their minds when they have new information, when they have some experience that changes their perspective. Because again, it seems like they're contradicting themselves and being inconsistent. We're so obsessed with this consistency because of the way we think using our rationality. In any case, Oppenheimer responds that he had moral concerns about the development of the super. But what the prosecutor keeps pointing out is that he was seemingly okay with the development of the fission bomb, and he was also okay with dropping it on Japan. And Oppie is struggling to reckon with the fact that it was his creation that created so much suffering. And he ultimately admits that no matter what, the Soviets would be pursuing atomic weapons when they knew that the Americans also had them. And he reveals what he's learned about the bomb since its development, which is that humans are a species that would tend to use any weapon they had their hands on, no matter how destructive it was. And it's such a terrible thing to realize that humans are, on average, a very dangerous, violent, and highly paranoid species. And honestly, it's remarkable, miraculous that nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945. But if we're being honest, not that much time has passed since the development of the bomb. World War II seems like a historical event, but in the course of human history, it might as well have happened yesterday. And so the consequences of this new age in which we live haven't fully played out yet. So things could change very rapidly and unexpectedly for the worse. So with all of this, all of the scrutiny on Oppenheimer and the fact that he seems to contradict himself and the fact that he was friends with communists in the past, all of this causes him to lose his security clearance. Rather unfairly because he was a loyal citizen, but somewhat understandably given the political climate. But when we go back to the fusion timeline, we see that Strauss also gets what he deserves when the scientist scientist David Hill testifies that a personal vendetta is what drove Strauss to persecute Oppenheimer. And this causes him to lose his Commerce Secretary nomination, which is really interesting because it's like the first one that wasn't confirmed in like 10 years or something like that. And I view this as justice, not just for what he did to Oppenheimer, but for the fact that he helped bring the H-bomb into being. And to be clear, it wasn't just him. And there are a lot of scenes that show Oppenheimer trying to advocate for arms control, but then the military establishment in the US, they get really suspicious and they're like, why is this guy trying to tell us not to create a bigger bomb? And so a lot of people were pushing back against Oppenheimer's humanitarian concerns. It's really great to know that some guy who's trying to prevent the destruction of the world was pushed out by a bunch of people who just wanted bigger bombs. But I do view what happened to Strauss as justice for the fact that the H-bomb came out. You know, Oppenheimer himself had to reckon with the fact of his creation, and Strauss also deserved some kind of justice for that. And again, that's how I interpret the meanings of the names fission and fusion for the two different storylines. Now, the movie ends by going back to that scene where Oppenheimer talks to Einstein. This time in color, and we get to see what they actually spoke about. Anyways, this scene is just incredible. The music is so good, the way it keys up, and it's all about these two geniuses reflecting on their legacies. Because this really all did start with Einstein. He's the one who realized that E equals mc squared and that there was this huge amount of energy within the atom. And Einstein says that the generation of scientists who came after him believed that he had lost the ability to understand what he had started. And this is because of the fact that Einstein never really bit the quantum bullet, because quantum mechanics to him seemed too strange to be true, and so he didn't really believe it. But he says that the same thing would happen to Oppenheimer, that they would celebrate his achievements, but ultimately others would decide what to do with his legacy, with the fact that this man's unprecedented understanding of the subatomic world was used to create nuclear weapons that would forever be a threat to the world. So just before Einstein leaves, Oppenheimer asks him to remember that discussion they had about the threat of a nuclear bomb igniting the atmosphere and destroying the world. Einstein says, yeah, I recall that conversation, and Oppenheimer drops his own bomb by saying that he believes they've pretty much already destroyed the world, essentially saying that their work has assuredly put mankind on the path to its own self-destruction. Einstein walks away because that's probably the darkest thing he's ever heard. And it probably made a lot of sense to Einstein because he also lived through World War II and saw just how reckless and chaotic and destructive humans could be. But Oppenheimer thinks that sooner or later, a nuclear war will destroy humanity. It's just a matter of time. And his gaze is just so devastating. This scene is incredible for so many reasons. And one reason is that if you think about it, the original fear was that a fission bomb would be used to set off a fusion reaction. But that's exactly what happened. Fusion bombs themselves are made of a fission bomb and which was used to set off a fusion reaction. So that part pretty much came true. And when you think about the fact that thousands of these bombs were created, it's almost as if the atmosphere is just waiting to be ignited by these weapons being unleashed. And it's not crazy to think that sooner or later this is going to happen, either by accident or deliberately, that these weapons are going to be used. This ending was one of the most chilling I've seen, and it was really terrifying to contemplate. Because I live on a planet amongst a species that I frankly don't trust with weapons like these. And as the world descends further into chaos, the possibility of nuclear weapons being used has increased. We now have hypersonic missiles that are basically impossible to shoot down. We have submarine-launched torpedoes and, whatever new weapon systems your tax dollars are being spent on. It's such a scary world, and yet it's our reality. We really do live in a world where weapons like this exist. And this sort of power requires us to be more morally sophisticated. They challenge us spiritually more than anything else ever has. I don't know what the future holds, but I do hope that nuclear weapons are never used again, and everybody else should also hope that. But if I'm being honest, I don't see how it's realistic that we prevent them from ever being used as long as we have them. Because at some point, the nuclear equivalent of Genghis Khan will just roll the dice. Huge rewards, even huger risks. And all of this is because humans have peered too deeply into the nature of reality. The immensity of our consciousness has reached this point. And one wonders whether it would be a good idea to go back to our ignorant state when the world around us and the subatomic world was still shrouded in mystery. Anyways, that was my discussion of Oppenheimer. Thanks for listening to me. I hope you found this enjoying. And I also hope that if you ever rewatch the film, you can appreciate it even more knowing all these little tidbits that I discussed. So yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.